I slowly opened my eyes, grabbing the phone that was resting next to my head, and pressed the snooze button. I then closed my eyes, desperately trying to get another 5 minutes of sleep. This was the 4th time I had repeated this task, much to the annoyance of the other Marines sleeping in the squad bay. "Bitch, turn your fucking alarm off. That's like the 20th time," groaned Corporal Dawson, laying on the rack next to mine. "It's the 4th time. Stop bitching," I grumbled back. "We've all been awake for the past hour anyway." I was right. Since we'd been out here on this training exercise, all of our sleep schedules had been disturbed, and our body's internal clocks would have us wake up typically an hour before we were supposed to. My attempts to return to slumber was futile, and I spent the next 5 minutes staring at the back of my eyelids. 5 minutes passed in what felt like 2, and once more our one-room living space was filled with the incessant beeping of my alarm, this time joined by 36 others. I let out a sigh and I crawled out of my sleeping bag, exposing myself to the cold air of the unheated room. I sat up and threw my legs over the side of my rack. I took a second to get my bearings and took in the room. The dust floating off the concrete floor of the narrow squad bay was illuminated by bright fluorescent lights that were affixed to the ceiling, the occasional flicker casting the room in a dull murkiness. Around me, fresh-faced and short-haired boots rushed to get dressed, being hurried by tense-faced and booming-voiced corporals wearing out-of-regulation mustaches. The terminal lance corporals, who had long since stopped caring, lazily emerged from their sleeping bags, content to take their time. As I got dressed, I asked Dawson about what was on the schedule for training this week, raising my voice to speak over the cacophony of "move faster, get your rifle," and "I, Corporal." "I don't know, man. According to Sergeant, we're going to be in cantonment all week, so probably just more of the same," Dawson said as he pulled on his trousers. Great, I thought. More of the same meant PT, basic knowledge classes, and worst of all, gun drills. You see, I hated gun drills more than anything else in the whole fucking world. Running back and forth and touching a candy cane to the ground because I couldn't get the gun up in less than 10 seconds all day was not what I was expecting to be doing when I joined the Marine Corps. I was about to ask him if there were any working parties going on today to see if I could get out of training, when the front door of the squad bay flung open. "Get the fuck outside right now. We have formation. Y'all ain't new," Sergeant Federico barked, his face full of its usual malice. "Hey, Sergeant," the room answered almost in unison. "It's too early for this shit," I mumbled under my breath. I had hoped that Sergeant Federico's 8-year career as a mortarman would have damaged his hearing to the point where he couldn't hear what I had said, but I underestimated his auditory detection abilities. "What the fuck did you say, bitch?" Sergeant Federico growled, taking a few steps in my direction. Nothing, Sergeant," I replied meekly, trying to avoid making eye contact. Sergeant Federico stared daggers at me, the pissed-off expression not leaving his face. "That's what I thought, bitch," Sergeant Federico said, making an about face and walking out of the room. "Fucking dumbass," Dawson said, shaking his head. "I know, right? He's such an asshole," I said, my confidence returning to me now that the sergeant was gone. "Nah, dickhead, I was talking about you," Dawson replied. A few minutes later, Dawson, me, and about 28 other Marines were standing in columns outside of our squad bay, shivering in the pre-dawn cold. A minute later, we were joined by the Marines from Section 1, who were living in the squad bay right next to ours. A few minutes after that, our platoon sergeant arrived and conducted counts. "Rifle," Gunnery Sergeant Richardson shouted in his booming voice. Down the line of Marines, each Marine calling out his number in a similar inflection. 1, 2, 3, Marines called out, going down the line. When it was my turn, I tapped my rifle and called out my respective number, and the count carried on. "NVGS," Gunny Richardson bellowed out. "Take 'em out. Let me see 'em," Sergeant Federico chimed in. Each Marine held up his pair of night vision goggles and counted. I moved my hand to my waist to grab mine from my NVG pouch that was strapped to my belt. As my hand met the belt, I felt nothing. "Oh, shit," I gasped, remembering that I had left my NVG pouch under my rack last night. The count had rapidly gotten to me, and when I didn't say anything, Sergeant Federico was immediately on my case. "Where are your NVGs?" Sergeant Federico inquired angrily. "Under my rack, Sergeant," I replied. The entire formation let out an exasperated groan. "There ain't no fucking way," Sergeant Federico screamed. "Go fucking get them." "Hey, Sergeant," I replied quickly, dashing through the formation back into the squad bay. I hastily retrieved my NVGs and returned to my spot in formation. In my peripheral vision, I could see Dawson giving me the side-eye. I could tell he was angry, and we both knew what was about to happen. As soon as formation ended, Sergeant Federico called me over. "Who is your squad leader, bitch?" Sergeant Federico screamed, about 3 inches from my face, his cologne overpowering me more than his yelling. "Corporal Dawson, Sergeant," I replied. "Dawson? Get the fuck over here." "Aye, Sergeant," Dawson said. He was already standing next to me. After about 20 minutes of Dawson and me doing a series of grueling exercises while being verbally torn apart by Sergeant Dawson, we were finally released when Gunny Richardson saved us. He told the sergeant that we had had enough, and that we were to go shave, eat chow, and then prepare for that day's training. As we were walking to the head, Dawson suddenly stopped and gave me a hard jab on the side of my arm. "What the hell was that, man? You've been in the Marine Corps for 3 years. How in the fuck do you forget to grab your NVGs?" Dawson said, his voice filled with hostility. "I don't know, man. I'm sorry. I took them out of my patch last night to clean them, which you told me to do, by the way," I replied. "And I also told you to put them back when you were fucking done." Dawson growled back. "Look, man, sorry. Won't happen again, I swear," I said sheepishly. Dawson sighed and gave me a serious look. He said, "Look, dude, you being a shitbag was cool when we were in boots and I wasn't your squad leader, but things have changed. I have a lot on my plate now, and I can't keep getting fucked up for your bullshit." Dawson and I had been together for practically our entire Marine Corps careers. We were in the same platoon on Paris Island. We went to the same school of infantry together, and we eventually hit the fleet together, being sent to the same unit. I'd say we were pretty good friends, well, up until a few months back. To make a long story short, Dawson got promoted, and I didn't. I honestly can't say that it wasn't fair. Dawson was a stellar Marine, and well, I wasn't. When he was studying and exercising in his free time, I was playing video games and getting drunk in mine. He was sent to advanced school, and I was never even considered. Upon his return, he was meritoriously promoted to corporal. As for me, well, NCO panels were a revolving door for me at that point. He was made as a squad leader, and I was placed in a squad. I was happy about it at first. I thought I'd be able to skate out of work and PT, but this unfortunately was not the case. Dawson was a very motivated NCO, and he volunteered our squad for everything. He would also personally PT us every single day, while the rest of our peer group would slink back to their rooms as soon as the lieutenant and gunnery sergeant were gone. Dawson would have us doing hill sprints and burpees at 5 in the morning. What didn't help matters was my attitude. I'd always been an asshole, but as soon as I was placed into Dawson's squad and had to deal with his moto bullshit, I got a lot worse. And every time I said or did something fucked up, Dawson would be punished for it. Sergeant Frederico always hated me, and he hated Dawson for being friends with me, so he was constantly looking for reasons to screw us up. The past few months have been miserable for us, and it put a strain on our friendship. Dawson gave me an annoyed look. Dude, you're my friend, and nothing will change that, but I can't keep putting up with all your shit. I actually like my job, man. And if I can't fix you, Frederico's going to fire me, and I'll be back doing gun drills with the boots. I chuckled. Boots like me, right? Dawson's expression softened. I didn't say that. Dawson shot back. All I want for you to do is to at least try to be better, for my sake. I thought about what he said for a moment. It was true that most of the problems he was going through could be attributed to me and my bullshit, and that he did really enjoy being a squad leader. I looked at him and saw that at this point there was no anger or hostility on his face, just an expression of exasperated desperation. I sighed. Okay, you're right. Sorry, dude. I've been a shitty Marine and even a shittier friend. I'll do better. I'll keep my gear on me at all times. I'll put effort into PT and I'll actually try during gun drills today. Dawson's face turned to skepticism. Yeah, I'll believe it when I see it. And with that, we resumed walking to the head. After we finished shaving, we left the head and walked to the chow hall. As we were walking in the building, we encountered First Lieutenant Adams. Good morning, sir, Dawson and I both said in unison. Yeah, what's up, guys? Lieutenant Adams said with a smile, revealing 2 rows of perfect white teeth. Now, Sergeant Frederico told me that you two had some gear retention issues at formation. His voice was dripping with its usual condescension. Yes, sir, I began. Dawson and I talked about it, and I think you mean Corporal Dawson. Lieutenant Adams interrupted. Dawson and I exchanged side-eyed glances. First Lieutenant Adams was our platoon commander. He was formerly a POG working in admin before he went to the Naval Academy. He was somehow commissioned as an infantry officer and was now our OIC. There were rumors that he was transferred to our unit from his last command because of hazing allegations, but I never believed them. He had too much of a stick up his ass to haze anyone. Yes, sir. Me and Corporal Dawson talked about it, and we've come up with a plan not only to help me retain my gear, but also to improve myself as a Marine as a whole, I said, barely able to hide the disdain in my voice. That's good news. I'm excited to see the results, Lieutenant Adams said, and with that, he walked past us, exiting the chow hall and walking in the direction of the COC. I hate that dude, I said a few minutes later between mouthfuls of powdered eggs. Who doesn't? Dawson asked before taking a swig of room temperature coffee. It was true. Very few people in our platoon liked Lieutenant Adams. His methods of leadership and personality left much to be desired. Even Sergeant Frederico didn't like him. But that's not saying much, because Sergeant Frederico typically didn't like anyone except for himself. We finished our meal and left the chow hall, walking back to our squad bay. Once we got there, Sergeant Frederico immediately had us set up our cannon, and we began doing gun drills at the ungodly hour of 6 a.m. An hour passed, and I was running to touch the aiming stake for what felt like the 100th time when Lieutenant Adams' voice pierced through the air. "Corporal Dawson, get your squad. You guys are going on a working party. Bring your flak and Kevlar," Lieutenant Adams said, his voice lacking its usual air of superiority. Thank God, I thought to myself. I didn't know how much more of this I could take. I could tell that Dawson was annoyed. He hated working parties. He saw them as beneath him, but nonetheless he instructed me and the two other guys on our gun, two boots named Henderson and Lewis, to break down the system and stage it inside. We quickly complied, and when we finished, we found ourselves standing in front of Lieutenant Adams, awaiting his orders. Sergeant Frederico was there also, looking more annoyed than usual. "You got all your guys here?" Lieutenant Adams asked Dawson. "Yes, sir," he replied in a professional tone. "Do you have all of your gear?" he asked, looking at me. "Yes, sir," I said, tapping my rifle and my NVG pouch, this time actually containing them. "Good," he said, and then he turned to face Sergeant Frederico. "Sergeant, take them down to the motor pool. You'll be briefed on your task when you get there." "Sir, can I speak with you in private?" Sergeant Frederico asked. "I believe we already did, Sergeant," the lieutenant replied matter-of-factly. "You will accompany them on this working party. Perhaps it'll be an opportunity for you to learn how to actually lead people." Most of the lower enlisted guys didn't like Lieutenant Adams because of the constant training he made us do. The NCOs hated him because of his refusal to consult them in private. If one of the corporals or sergeants fucked up, the whole platoon would be witness to Lieutenant Adams publicly berating them. I could tell Sergeant Frederico was straining with every fiber of his being not to swing at the lieutenant. After a few seconds of Sergeant Frederico staring daggers at the lieutenant, he finally responded. "Yes, sir," he said through gritted teeth, and then he turned to us. "All right, assholes, let's go." The five of us walked briskly down the gravel road, past the low-lying buildings on either side of the path. Walking a few paces behind Sergeant Frederico, I'd asked him what we'd be doing. "Why the fuck are you talking to me? Ask your squad leader," Sergeant Frederico barked. I rolled my eyes and I asked Dawson what we would be doing, and when he didn't know, he asked Sergeant Frederico. "I don't fucking know. Sir and the other lieutenants got told to give up some Marines for a working party this morning at their brief, and for all I know, we're going to be filling up sandbags or some other shit," Sergeant Frederico said bluntly. I thought back to Lieutenant Adams. He seemed different from his usual smug self when he told us about the working party. Usually when he ordered us to do bitch work, he had an air of superiority around him, but this time he seemed almost concerned. After a few minutes of walking, we eventually reached our destination. The motor pool was a dirt field usually filled to the brim with military vehicles. On this day, however, it was mostly empty, aside from a green 7-ton and a Coyote tan JLTV. 30 other Marines stood milling about, waiting to be told what to do. After 10 minutes, a white van pulled up, and Lieutenant Adams and a man I didn't recognize emerged from it. First Lieutenant Adams called out in an annoyed-sounding voice. Dawson and I chuckled at the lieutenant being roped into this working party. I could see Sergeant Frederico crack a rare smile. We all started to make our way over to Lieutenant Adams to hear what he had to say. As I approached, I took a second to analyze the man standing next to him. He appeared to be a middle-aged man, maybe in his late 40s. His receding hairline pushed back his graying hair. His face was stern. His piercing blue eyes seemed to bore into me when he looked in my direction. He wore a Marine uniform. However, it lacked name tapes or rank. Based on his age and the fact that he was with Lieutenant Adams, I knew he couldn't have been a private. Whoever this man was, he must have been important. "Alright guys, I've got something a little different for you today," Lieutenant Adams said, addressing the crowd. "Something different?" I whispered to Dawson. "That doesn't sound good." "We'll be assisting Mr. Lieutenant Adams began, pausing to crane his neck to look at the man's non-existent name tags. "Jacobs," the man said flatly. "Mr. Jacobs," Lieutenant Adams continued. "He's with a look of embarrassment swept across the lieutenant's face, and again he turned to Mr. Jacobs, hoping he would provide the name of whatever organization he was part of. "That isn't relevant for today's test," Mr. Jacobs said, not even turning to look at the lieutenant. Lieutenant Adams looked startled at Mr. Jacobs' blunt response. Right," the lieutenant said, clearly perturbed by the strange man. "Today we'll be assisting Mr. Jacobs with a chemical test." "Chemical test?" I thought to myself. What in the actual fuck? I exchanged glances with the Marines to my left and to my right. I could tell we were all confused by what the lieutenant had just said. "What in the hell you mean, a chemical test?" Sergeant Frederico called out, not caring if his tone offended Lieutenant Adams or Mr. Jacobs. Lieutenant Adams shot an annoyed look at the sergeant. Lieutenant and the sergeant had a strained working relationship, and Sergeant Frederico having an attitude with him certainly wasn't helping. Lieutenant stammered, beginning to show cracks in his composure. "To be specific," Mr. Jacobs interjected, "it's a test to determine the effectiveness of a new model of hazmat suit." If he was bothered by Sergeant Frederico's outburst, he didn't show it. "These newer models should prove to be more durable and longer lasting," he continued, "as well as being less cumbersome to wear. We're going out to the field and we're going to spray some CS gas on you guys. That's the test." Lieutenant Adams suddenly blurted out, attempting to reestablish himself as the person in charge. "It won't be that bad. We've all done the gas chamber before." I raised my hand. "Where are these hazmat suits, sir?" As if on cue, a white pickup truck pulls into the motor pool, its bed filled to the brim with rolled-up hazmat suits. Soon Henderson and Lewis were standing in the bed of the truck, tossing out the bundled-up hazmat suits to the crowd of Marines surrounding the truck. Henderson tossed me one, and I inspected it. The first thing I noticed was a lack of a camouflage pattern. All the hazmat suits I'd seen in my time in the Marine Corps had the old camouflage pattern from the 1990s. These were a black color. I figured that they lacked camouflage because they were prototypes. The other thing that differed from the hazmat suits I was used to was that this one came entirely in one piece. The other suits I was familiar with came in pieces. The boots, pants, top and gloves were all separate. As soon as we had all received a suit, we were instructed to put them on. It was much easier to put these suits on compared to the older suits. All we had to do was unzip the back and step into it, and then have someone else re-zip the back. Mr. Jacobs was right. These suits were easier to wear. Mine fit like a glove. After we were all in our suits, Lieutenant Adams started to hand out gas masks. The gas masks were just the standard ones we all were issued. We all placed our gas masks in the carriers that came with them and waited for our next task. Lieutenant Adams called out, "I need 2 drivers, and 2 A drivers." Sergeant Frederico instantly volunteered me and Dawson. Dawson had a JLTV license, and I had an A driver's license. I suspect Sergeant Frederico volunteered us because he didn't want to ride in the back of the 7-ton with the rest of the Marines. My suspicions were confirmed when he placed himself in the back seat of the JLTV, stating that he would ride with us to make sure that we were driving right. He was joined in the back by Lieutenant Adams. We were designated as the lead vehicle, and we took off toward the training area. Lieutenant Adams gave us directions from the back seat, and every few minutes Sergeant Frederico would shout at us to speed up or to slow down. "It's going to be a long drive," Lieutenant Adams said. "The range is pretty far." "Tell me again what this test is going to be," Sergeant Frederico asked immediately after, shouting at Dawson to keep his eyes on the road. "It'll just be like I said at the brief," Lieutenant Adams said, not taking his eyes off the map that sat in his lap. "We're going to range 341, and they're going to spray us with some tear gas." "And who are they going to be?" Sergeant Frederico asked. The lieutenant looked up from the map, a puzzled look on his face. After a second, he responded, "Mr. Jacobs didn't say. I assume there'll be some CBRN Marines out there waiting for us." The sergeant didn't look satisfied by that answer. "Right. And where will Jacobs be during this test?" "He told me that he would be observing from a distance," Lieutenant Adams replied. "I'm supposed to radio back the results." "This all sounds very strange, sir," Dawson said from the driver's seat. "Shut up and keep driving," Sergeant Frederico growled. After about an hour, we finally arrived at range 341. The range was filled with dilapidated multi-story buildings. Back in the day, the range was used for urban combat training, but since then, newer facilities had been built in different areas of the base, and this one had fallen out of use. Dawson parked the JLTV near the entrance of the range. The 7-ton parked parallel to us. Soon after parking, all the Marines had disembarked and began milling around the vehicle. As we exited our vehicle, Lieutenant Adams pulled out his radio and brought it to his face. "COC, this is Oscar 2 Alpha, radio check." Mr. Jacobs' voice came through the radio. "Are you in position?" The officer looked surprised at Mr. Jacobs' lack of radio etiquette. Yes, sir, we have arrived at the range. Are there guys on their way to?" "Order your Marines to stand out in the open and equip their gas masks. The test will begin shortly," Mr. Jacobs interrupted. "Yes, sir," he replied. "Everyone put on your gas masks and stand over there," he shouted, pointing at a wide open space in the center of the range. Everyone complied with the order, equipping their gas masks and checking them to make sure they were properly sealed. I pulled my mask over my face, wincing as it pulled my hair back. I turned to the lieutenant to ask him a question. "So, when will the test start?" I asked. As if on cue, the air was suddenly filled with the sound of rotors. I looked up to see a black helicopter with no military markings flying low overhead. As it passed over the center of the range, above where most of the Marines were standing, 2 large black canisters were dropped from the bottom of the helicopter. The Marines ran in every direction so as not to be struck by the barrels. A few seconds after impacting the ground, the canisters began emitting white gas. "Gas, gas, gas!" several Marines cried out. "What the fuck? Those barrels almost hit them," Sergeant Frederico yelled out, his voice filled with shock rather than its usual anger. The helicopter quickly sped away, disappearing over the horizon. As the gas dispersed amongst the Marines, several began to cough and gasp for air. They must have not properly sealed their masks. "Oh, fuck," one Marine cried out. "It's burning my eyes." "Tear gas is just tear gas," the lieutenant said to himself, watching the scene unfold before him. After about a minute passed, the tear gas dissipated. Lieutenant Adams brought the radio back up to his face. "Okay, the gas is gone. Aside from the guys who didn't seal their masks properly, it looks like the suits worked pretty well. Have the Marines remove their masks," Mr. Jacobs said, speaking through the radio, not acknowledging what the lieutenant said. "The test has concluded." "Hell no," Sergeant Frederico objected. "I'm not taking off my mask. There's still CS in the air." He was right. While we couldn't see it, CS gas would linger in the air for a while after being released. "Fine, you guys could keep your masks on," the lieutenant said. Though the gas mask obscured his face, his tone made it clear that he was annoyed, and perhaps a little scared. Sergeant Frederico was a pretty intimidating guy. "Lieutenant, have the Marines remove their gas masks," Mr. Jacobs said. Yes, sir," Lieutenant Adams replied. After saying that, he gave the hand signal for all clear and shouted, "All clear. Take off your masks." Sergeant Frederico wasn't the only one who was hesitant to remove his mask. While the majority of the Marines began removing their gas masks, gagging as soon as the residual tear gas made contact with their eyes, several called out to Lieutenant Adams. "Sir, it's not clear. There's still CS in the area," one called out. "Why don't you lead by example and take off your mask?" another shouted. "Shut the hell up," the lieutenant snapped back, his anxious tone being replaced by one of anger. "Take off your gas mask or I'll have you." The lieutenant was cut off by the familiar sound of helicopter rotors approaching. We looked to see the black helicopter flying just as low as before, returning from the direction it had originally departed to. As it flew over us, the side doors slid open. From our position by the JLTV, I could see two men wearing hazmat suits identical to ours standing in the open helicopter door. "They're making another run," Sergeant Frederico called out while simultaneously making sure his own mask was still sealed. "Get your mask back on." The few dozen Marines who took their masks off fumbled to put them back on, but most weren't quick enough. The two men inside the helicopter rolled a barrel out of the open door. As soon as the barrel had left the helicopter, the pilot instantly pulled up, wanting to put as much distance between himself and the ground as possible. As soon as the barrel impacted the ground, it exploded a bright red cloud of gas, blasting out from the spot of the impact. The Marines who were within a few meters of the explosion were instantly killed or maimed by shrapnel. I'd consider them the lucky ones. The Marines who survived the initial explosion were rapidly enveloped by the red gas. As the gas reached me, I closed my eyes and I placed my hand over my mask's outlet valve and exhaled sharply. I prayed my filters weren't expired. I opened my eyes to see that the gas had quickly dissipated, leaving dozens of Marines either doubled over, vomiting, or flailing wildly on the ground screaming. The handful of Marines who had gotten their masks back on in time, or had never taken theirs off to begin with, immediately rushed to aid their compatriots. A muffled, retching sound came from below me. I turned and saw Dawson laying on his back, convulsing, vomit and mucus running down his neck, bubbling out from his gas mask. His mask must not have been properly sealed. Upon seeing the state Dawson was in, Sergeant Frederico immediately began barking orders. "Adams,
"Get someone on that fucking radio," the sergeant yelled and then turned to me. "Get that damn mask off of him. I'm going to help the others," Sergeant Frederico said as he spun around and dashed to the nearest distressed Marine.
I knelt down next to Dawson and yanked off his mask. His mouth was coated in vomit, and his face was contorted into an expression of pure agony. His bloodshot eyes darted wildly, blinking furiously. His arms were curled at his chest, shaking fiercely. "Oh shit. What the hell?" I panted out as I knelt beside my injured friend. I tried to recall what our corpsmen had taught us, but they never prepared us for a situation like this. I quickly determined that he wasn't bleeding, at least externally, and quickly positioned myself behind his head, attempting to clear his airway. As I lowered my head to his chest, I caught a glance of Lieutenant Adams, still standing frozen in place, staring at the mass casualty event before him. "Sir," I shouted angrily. He brought his gaze down to me and said nothing, his mouth agape. "The radio. Call for help?" That finally broke his stupor, and he quickly fumbled to bring the radio to his face. "COC, this is Oscar 2 Alpha, stand by for the 9 line," the lieutenant screamed into the radio. The radio responded with silence. Grown more frantic, he tried again. "COC, this is Oscar 2 Alpha, fucking respond." Once again, no reply came through the radio. Lieutenant Adams shouted into the radio, "COC, Jacobs, anyone, I know you're listening. God damn it, we need..." Lieutenant Adams was cut off by the sudden shriek that came from a few meters away. I'd never heard a person or animal make a noise like that. It sounded guttural, feral even. The two of us turned to see Sergeant Frederico grappling with the Marine he had just been attending to. "What in the hell are you doing?" Sergeant Frederico said through gritted teeth as he wrestled the Marine to the ground. "I'm trying to help you." "Fuck you. I'll rip your heart out," the Marine hissed back. I was shocked at how much the sergeant was struggling. You have to understand that Sergeant Frederico was a 6'3", 210-pound mass of solid muscle. This Marine was a head shorter and couldn't have weighed half of what Sergeant Frederico weighed. Despite this, the Marine was somehow holding his own against him. I looked up from the melee in front of me to see a similar scene unfolding across the range. Up and down the field, the Marines who had been exposed to the red gas were now attacking their unexposed counterparts, and the fighting was vicious. I looked on in horror as a group of the unmasked Marines held down a Marine and savagely beat him. The unmasked all howled in animal rage as they hammered their fists into him. Once he was dead, they dissipated in every direction, looking for new targets. A gas mask wearing Marine who had been maimed by the explosion and was laying on the ground, trying to keep his intestines inside of him, let out a desperate cry for help. Unfortunately, one of the unmasked answered his plea. The unmasked marched up to the injured Marine and without hesitating, stomped on the man's head. Blood, brain matter, and shards of skull burst from the gas mask visor. The unmasked let out a croaky laugh and immediately set out to find a different victim. I saw Henderson, his face filled with manic rage, dragging a Marine by the leg behind him, and taking a closer look, I realized that it was Lewis. Lewis kicked and fought and tried to break free from Henderson's grasp, but Henderson was too strong. He dragged Lewis into a 4-story building. A few minutes later, they reappeared on the roof. In a horrifying feat of strength, Henderson pressed Lewis above his head and heaved him over. He landed on his back, dying instantly. One Marine stood with his back to an old building, surrounded by several of the unmasked. He held his unloaded rifle like a club and swung wildly whenever one of them tried to approach. One darted up to him, and I could hear the sickening crack of the rifle making impact with its skull from where I was. The unmasked crumpled to the floor, motionless. I thought he had killed it when it suddenly sprung back up. The Marine swung his rifle again, but this time the unmasked caught it with one hand and yanked it back. The Marine, still holding on to the rifle, was pulled forward and landed on his face in the center of the group. The unmasked then fell upon him, tearing him apart. "Oh my God," said the lieutenant. Suddenly, Dawson's arms shot up and wrapped themselves around my neck, pulling my head down to his chest. "What the hell?" I choked out as Dawson's headlock tightened. "You fucking bitch. You fucking piece of shit." Dawson growled into my ear as he strangled me. "You're going to die." I started to see stars and my vision began to fade when I heard Dawson let out a pained grunt. His group loosened and I quickly pulled myself up. I turned to see Lieutenant Adams had broken out of his stupor and had kicked Dawson in the head, freeing me. "Well, don't just stand there, help me restrain him," the lieutenant said before Dawson had grabbed his ankle and pulled him off of his feet. The lieutenant had fallen hard on his back, and Dawson was on top of him in an instant. He ripped his gas mask off and tossed it aside. He then began punching the dazed officer in the face, laughing wickedly as he did. "I want to see your face while I kill you, you college boy piece of shit," Dawson said as his fist made contact with the lieutenant's face. The lieutenant tried to respond, but the only thing that came out of his mouth was blood and broken teeth. I tried to pull Dawson off the lieutenant, but an elbow to the face sent me flying back. I sat stunned on the floor, looking for Sergeant Frederico. He was the only one at this point who could help the lieutenant. I turned to see he had finally gotten the unmasked he was fighting in a chokehold, and with a swift motion of his arms, the unmasked's head was turned to an odd angle, and it finally fell limp. Sergeant Frederico's victory was short-lived, however, as before he could catch his breath, 3 more unmasked pounced on him. I looked back at Dawson, still beating the lieutenant's head in, and with every blow he would list off some grievance he had with the lieutenant, some of which I'd never knew he had. Soon all that was left of Lieutenant Adams' head was a bloody pile of brains and blood, and Dawson then turned his attention to me, glaring at me with a face full of rage. I then noticed that I was the last Marine still wearing a mask left alive, and all the unmasked noticed it too. Thinking quickly, I did something I probably should have done from the start, and sprinted to the JLTV, the unmasked hot on my heels. I threw open the door and dove inside. I slammed it shut and engaged the combat locks. I repeated the process with the other 3 doors. I let out a gasp when Dawson slammed his head into the window and then let out a sigh of relief when it didn't shatter. The vehicle was quickly swarmed by the unmasked, all pulling on the doors and banging on the windows, demanding that I get out. I started the JLTV and waited for the vehicle's computer to boot up, cursing the modern technology as I sat surrounded by demons. As soon as it was fully booted, an error message was displayed on the screen. "Warning. Low tire pressure in the front left tire," the message read. Confused, I looked out the window to see several of the unmasked stabbing the tire with rudimentary knives made out of scraps that they had found around the range. Soon, the computer alerted me that all 4 tires were experiencing pressure issues. "Fuck it," I exclaimed as I put my foot on the gas and sped forward and steered towards the exit. It was a bad idea. The JLTV only made it a few meters before the front tires exploded, causing the vehicle to go into a spin and roll over. I was thrown around the interior of the vehicle until it finally came to a stop upside down next to the range's entrance. I woke up a few minutes later, dazed and bruised, but okay. The vehicle was surrounded by the unmasked, slamming their fists and rifles into the windows, furiously trying to break in. After a few minutes of this, something strange happened. Once they realized that they weren't going to break in, the JLTV is practically a tank, they seemed to turn on each other. They set upon each other with the same ferocity and barbarity that they had with the other Marines. I closed my eyes and tried to shut out the sounds of death as they murdered each other, but I couldn't. They screamed at each other in distorted voices. They would shriek about how much they hated each other and how they always wanted to kill one another. And this went on for hours. I'm writing this now on my cell phone as night falls upon Range 341. Dawson is the only one left, and he's staring at me through the windshield. Occasionally, he'll give the window a kick or yank furiously on the door handle. Sometimes he'll go on a rant about how much of a piece of shit I am, and how I was going to pay for getting him fucked up all the time. But mostly, he just stares at me. His bloodshot eyes seem to glow in the darkness. I've tried calling for help, but it seems like something is jamming the signal. I'm not completely alone with Dawson, though. I could see the helicopter from before, hovering in the sky a few hundred meters away. It's been there all day. If I had to guess, I'd say that Mr. Jacobs is on board, observing the results of his experiment. I'm going to try to post this. Hopefully it'll go through. If you're reading this, then I guess it did. Mr. Jacobs, if you're somehow reading this, well then fuck you. I hope you burn in hell for what you've done here. I hope your experiment was worth it. When I joined the Marine Corps and took an oath saying I was willing to die for my country, this wasn't really what I had in mind.